Good evening, everyone. I'm Sophie Pavel from Meadows, and it's wonderful to see such a fantastic turnout tonight. Over 250 people have registered, which is just amazing. I hope you've all had a good day and you're enjoying the slightly darkening evenings this September. Now, tonight we're kicking off with the first of our autumn-winter series of online talks for the Meadow Makers Network. Now, this is a lovely, friendly community connecting more meadows with other West Country Meadows groups and individuals who care about wildflower-rich grasslands and wildlife habitats. And if you haven't joined the forum yet, you can find the link in the chat box. It's a free and just a really nice way to swap ideas, ask questions, be part of the community, or just share what's going on in your patch. Now, we have a wonderful evening coming up, a really fascinating talk, and I'm keen to get started as soon as we can. So I'm very pleased to introduce our star this evening, Waxcap Grasslands. We're also delighted to welcome Sean Cooch from Natural England. Now, Sean's a grassland ecologist with a special love for fungi, especially waxcaps and their colourful friends. Sean spent years surveying and researching these amazing fungi, and they're not only beautiful, but they're also a key sign of healthy, species-rich grasslands. Sean brings over 18 years of experience in conserving and restoring grasslands, combining deep scientific knowledge with practical hands-on habitat management. Sean's going to give us the lowdown on why these habitats are so vital and how we can protect them. And as we go along, as always, please feel free to drop any questions into the chat box, and we'll have a nice Q&A session with Sean at the end. So without further ado, hello, Sean, and over to you.
Good evening. Thank you, Sophie, for that introduction. I've actually been working in nature conservation now for nearly 30 years, so I'm probably giving away my age a little bit there. Anyway, before I delve into Waxcap Grasslands, actually, just need to ask, is the presentation up yet or not? Oh, can you hear me? Hello? I can't actually see anything at the moment. It would be useful if somebody just put a thumbs up. Can you hear that? Sophie?
Yeah, the presentation's up, Sean. I can see it really well.
Okay. Can
Yeah.
you? That's fine.
It's looking good.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Right. Sorry about that slight delay. There's been a few technical issues. That's all. Anyway, before I delve into Waxcap Grasslands, I just want you to think about what it means when we talk about biodiversity, particularly in terms of the number of species that are found in grasslands. And as a leader, I just want you to think about plants. When I first started as an ecologist, certainly, if like many people, I started with birds and bird watching, chasing around the country, twitching back in the day, looking for all sorts of rarities. I then graduated onto insects and actually did a dissertation when I was at university on the northern brown Argus butterfly. And then largely a result of my work, I did a lot of surveys of wildflower meadows and really concentrated on wildflowers, mosses and liverworts. Eventually, within Natural England, where I've been actually now for 24 years, I became a grassland ecologist and still thinking about the plant species that I mentioned earlier. You know, where I am in Dorset, the chalk downlands are famous for their species richness. And if you're lucky, you might get 20 to 40 species of wildflowers within a quadrat, and over a whole site, you might get 45, 60 species of plants overall. So I just want you to hold on to that thought. And roughly around 12 years ago, I was surveying some grassland on the army ranges of Purbeck, down near the village of Tyne, which was abandoned during the Second World War, when I stumbled upon some large red mushrooms, which turned out to be the spectacular crimson waxcap. From that point on, I was kind of fascinated, because they are very beautiful, as you'll see from many of the slides tonight, but also I was intrigued as what that meant ecologically. So what I'm going to do now, obviously, is introduce you to what a waxcap grassland is. Now, first of all, what is a waxcap is probably a key question. What does it mean? And it literally means wet head, or just very wet. Now, waxcaps come in all sorts of colours, as you'll see from this slide, but they also come in all sorts of different slimy variations as well, from polished surfaces, greasy, and very, very slippery. And they also have an interesting smell. Not all of them, but and a taste. And if you're out in the field with myself or any other field mycologist, a little kiss test is a way to sometimes test and identify certain species. So that's kind of the wax caps, or what is sometimes known as the hygrocybe, if we're using the Latin or scientific names. But what is actually a waxcap grassland? Excuse me. Well, what we're talking about here is something, and there is actually a surprising number of definitions for waxcap grasslands, but in its simplest form, these grasslands are nutrient poor, so very low in nutrients such as phosphate and nitrogen. They tend to be unimproved grasslands, but interestingly, sometimes, and in certain areas, they can be semi-improved grasslands. But critically, the really important aspect is that they have usually a long-term or a long period of being undisturbed. And so we can look at them in perhaps the same ways that we might look at ancient woodlands. So they're old and ancient. And some of our best waxcap grasslands are centuries old. And interestingly, what we know from Victorian reservoirs, particularly built in northern England, where the grasslands have existed in a semi-natural state now for well over 150 years, these sites actually tend to be some of our richest waxcap sites. Now, the other key element is that the management is low-key, often traditional. When I say traditional, term that not sometimes everybody agrees with, but we're talking about things like low-level grazing with cattle, sheep, but also things like hay meadow management as well. And you might not think that hay meadows are a classic place to find waxcaps, but if the management is cutting the hay followed with grazing, then these are important sites, or can be important sites. Now, often these grasslands are mossy. They can be sedge rich, full of low-growing sedges, but they're not always actually full of wild flowers. They can actually be quite poor. And if you look at certain lowland acid grasslands, or upland acid grasslands for that matter, these often have a low number of sort of flowering wild flowers. They tend to be very full of fine grasses, but the number of flowering plants can be quite small. And it goes without saying that waxcap grasslands tend to support a rich assemblage of fungi, not just waxcaps, but I'll come on to the others in a minute. On the less nice note, if you like, one of the issues that we have with waxcap grasslands, perhaps with all grasslands, is they are still declining. And again, I will talk a little bit more about that later on. So, as I said, we're not just talking about waxcaps. From an assessment or a scientific point of view, what we're really looking at is a group of fungi called the CHEGD. And as you can see, quite obviously why it's called CHEGD. It's laid out in this format with, in English, the clubs, corals and spindles. You have the waxcaps or the hygrocybe. You have also this group called the pink gills. And the little box that I've got there where I was out surveying is an example of quite a number of pink gills, waxcaps, clubs, corals and spindles. I'm not sure there were earth tongues in there, but also this rather interesting group as well, the Ds, which are crazed caps, meadow caps and fan vaults. So what I'm going to do is introduce you to this group so that you're familiar. And I'm sure many of you on this presentation are very familiar with these fungi already. But if you're not, hopefully this is an interesting introduction for you. If you are, well, hopefully some of the pictures will be nice and you'll recognize some of the species that are on the screen. So just an introduction to the clubs, corals and spindles, or the clavarioid fungi. This is just a selection of them. As you can see, they come in various colors, shapes and forms. And some of them are quite spectacular as well. The one down in the far corner, the far right-hand corner, is the violet coral, which is a fairly rare species, but when you find it, you definitely know that you found something pretty special. It's just an illustration of some of the variety of clavarias that we get. the waxcaps. Now these are actually, it's a big group, the waxcap fungi, the hygroscyabe, and this is just a small selection. And as you can see, a bit like the clubs, corals and spindles, they come in all sorts of colours. And again, if you're lucky enough to be out in the field, really from now all the way through to Christmas, if you're lucky, there's a chance, if you go to the right sort of grasslands, you might come across this beautiful collection of fungi, fruiting fungi. Fruiting is not the correct term, but I'm just going to use that today. And they come in reds, oranges, yellows, greens, browns, and the other interesting aspect, as I said, all sorts of textures as well, particularly the caps and the stem. And a particularly important group is the pink gills, which, as the slide suggests, forms the largest number of species in terms of the CHEGD group that occur within the grasslands. The latest information that we have suggests there could be up to 100 different species of pink gills occurring within our grasslands. And again, this just as an illustration of the variety of them. And they are actually subtly very beautiful and a variety of colours as well. And once you get to appreciate pink gills, sometimes people just appreciate them for what they are, because they are notoriously difficult to identify. This is hours spent looking down a microscope at spores and different lengths of the structures within their gills and caps. So they are very, very difficult to identify. In fact, the ones I put up there are some of the easiest ones. The earth tongues, a very interesting group. Now, the earth tongues tend to be quite small, and this is really nose to the turf to try and find these. And quite importantly, or certainly in terms of finding them, these tend to occur or are most frequent where the sward is relatively short. And we're talking about grazed turf heights or cut turf of sort of 1 centimetre to 5 centimetres. Much longer than that, they can be very, very difficult to find. That's not to say you won't find them, but they're easiest to find in short grazed swards. They're also very well represented on sand dune communities as well as grassland. But the earth tongues are a really bizarre group, and they look like little snakes coming out of the sward. Then finally, this is the D group, some known as the fan vaults, meadow caps and crazed caps. These tend to be the rarest, although the crazed cap in this picture particularly is frequent in a lot of ancient Waxcap grasslands, and is now considered to be quite a good indicator of species-rich sites. The others, the meadow cap, which is the furry-looking mushroom in the middle, is still particularly rare and internationally so. And then the others are often quite small and quite hard to find without quite a lot of diligent looking. They're the fan vaults. So that's a little introduction to the grassland fungi, not just the waxcaps, I'd say the CHEGD assemblage. And I'd say hopefully that gives you an idea of what can occur. Now, where do we find waxcap grasslands is a question that I'm often asked. And it would be fair to say, actually, you can find them almost anywhere, but it's not quite as straightforward as that. It never is. But what you can do is, particularly for the uplands, any area of grazed turf or meadows has the potential to support a waxcap assemblage and the other fungi. And this picture at the top there is actually up at Hadrian's Wall, which is one of the real hotspots in the country. And if you ever get the chance to walk along the grasslands at Hadrian's Wall, it's well worth looking out for grassland fungi. But equally, in the lowlands, they occur on all types of grassland, whether that's acid, calcareous, the chalk grasslands, and our neutral hay meadows as well. So another important place to look. And just as a little aside, churchyards, graveyards, cemeteries, they can be absolutely fantastic. And there are some really top sites. And I think actually there's an area of work for people to do. So if you get the chance, visit your local churchyard or cemetery and see what might occur, because these are old grasslands. If you think about the age of churches, well, you know, these going back to medieval Saxon times. And so there's a real chance that they have been there a long time. The only disturbance they get, of course, and a lot of graveyards now don't have any burials, but that was the only real disturbance they had. And because they tended to be small and localized, it seems that hasn't had any real impact on the grassland community. The picture with the big crimson waxcaps is a typical hay meadow, a traditional hay meadow, which is actually now a site of special scientific interest. And that is traditionally cut for hay and then grazed as the aftermath from really August through to the end of October. And it maintains a short sward, and hence this particular site has over 26 species of waxcaps in it. So it's a very good example of a traditional hay meadow that's then subsequently cut. And then the picture in the middle is an aerial photograph of effectively a housing estate, which is actually an army housing estate. I won't say where, but the lawns there are cut very short, as perhaps you'd expect on an army base. But this particular site and those areas in the blue hatching are very rich waxcap and other fungi. And it's believed that the grassland here actually originates from sandy, acid grassland, and it's just being maintained now as lawns as part of the Army's kind of tidy management. But that happens to be very, very good for waxcap grasslands. So that's a very quick introduction to where they occur. Now, another question that was asked, and what I said I'd talk about today, is about the nature conservation of grasslands, and how do we assess the nature conservation value of these sites. So I was fortunate back in 2017 to be asked to join the group that looked at reviewing the site of special scientific interest guidelines, and you can see there that the publication for the JNCC came into being, where a new evaluation of not just waxcaps but other fungi as well. But I work particularly on the Waxcap Grassland chapter, and the upshot of that, these are new guidelines that enabled the statutory bodies such as Natural England and for Scotland, Nature Scotland, Nature Resources Wales, have now got the guidelines to actually notify sites. So there was a scoring methodology, and this is it. And this information is in those guidelines and is worth looking at because it's more detailed than just obviously this table with the thresholds for how you evaluate a site. And these are national guidelines or UK guidelines. They're not just England guidelines. I obviously represent England for Natural England, but these are the UK guidelines. And they set the standard for what we would regard as an important, nationally important waxcap fungi site. Now, actually, we're looking to rewrite those for various reasons, which I'll come on to. But as you'll see, the thresholds are quite high. So to achieve a nationally important waxcap grassland, you've got to have 19 species of waxcaps, and quite a high threshold for the pink gills, actually, 15, etc., etc. Again, it's important to just say this isn't a fixed figure. These are under review all the time, and that's something that I'm working on with other colleagues, and we're looking to revise that, not immediately, but probably within the next couple of years. But as well as working on the national guidelines, I've also been working on developing regional, county and locally important sites. Now that's still a little work in progress, although that work is nearly complete, and you can look back and see what the national guidelines are. And interesting, it's just worth saying that other counties and record centres, wildlife trusts, have developed their own scoring system. What I've been doing is using national records and data to put together a kind of all-encompassing one that could be used by people. But there's no reason why local groups or local fungus groups as well, working with the local record centres and the Wildlife Trust, for example, can't develop their own. But as I've been analysing more and more data. Again, I'll talk about that. In effect, what we've ended up with is a kind of halving of the scoring system for the national ones. Again, this isn't fixed, and even now I'm looking to probably modify or amend some of the detail there. Lovely pictures of pink wax caps, and maybe there'd be questions about some of the pictures as well, but I'm not going to go through all the pictures, but hopefully some people recognise them, and if you don't, we'll just appreciate how lovely these species are. And as well as the scoring mechanism, we also developed what are called high diversity indicator species. So a group or a suite of grassland fungi, at the moment, just the waxcaps, to assess whether a site was of significance just by assessing a smaller group, a subgroup, if you like, of species that represented, or what we thought represented, likelihood of rich waxcap sites. Since the publication in 2018, again, I've been working on whether we could develop that with other CHEGD, other grassland fungi, and in fact, so the waxcap group is currently 23 different high diversity indicator species. So if you have one or more of those, there's a likelihood, or at least a possibility, that you've got a rich site. But equally, there are other of the grassland fungi assemblage that may actually tell you that it also represents a rich site. And that particular picture of a club here is one of our skinny clubs or flesh clubs, and they are going to be added as a high diversity indicator, or the aim is to recommend them to be high diversity indicators, along with some crazed caps, one of the meadow cap, and a few pink gills as well. So that's a work in progress, but definitely something that will add value and allow people to assess a site for its importance. And I've kind of put part 2 here. It's not strictly a part 2, but now that we've seen what waxcap grasslands are, some of the value indicators, or indicators that indicate how important these sites are. I want to look at the nature conservation importance of waxcap grassland in the UK. And again, like I say, I represent England, but what is true of England is actually also true of the UK. So England has the same as Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and we can, if you could include the British Isles and Ireland, of international importance for its waxcap grasslands. Now, dare I say, within the nature conservation world, that most people will be aware that when we're talking about these sites and grassland sites, there are threats, and there are multiple threats to grassland sites, whether it's grassland for fungi, whether it's grassland for wildflowers, priority habitat grasslands as an example. We're also going to look at species at risk, and we're going to use the IUCN criteria just to have a quick look at what that means for red listing species in England in this instance. But I also just want to do a little bit about protection of grassland fungi sites. And critically, the management and conservation. We've already spoken a little bit about management and conservation of these sites. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the really interesting areas, and I don't know if there's anybody on the call that works in this field, but is the DNA or eDNA, which means environmental DNA. And this is a field that's developed massively in the last couple of years, and its importance for assessing different taxon groups is really rising up fast in terms of the assessment of sites for nature conservation. And for fungi, it's proving particularly important. And when I did the guidelines back in 2018, when we were assessing sites, the use of DNA, it wasn't new, but it wasn't probably well developed enough for us to consider it to be used to assess sites. Now, if we were to rewrite the guidelines, we would almost certainly include using DNA assessments as an evaluation tool for the guidelines, for notification guidelines. So threats to waxcap grassland. One of the biggest threats still is direct grassland habitat loss. And although there's often a figure trotted out about the 97% of grasslands have been lost since effectively the 1950s up to about the mid-1980s, and that figure has kind of stuck. But we still, unfortunately, I work at the front end of nature conservation with Natural England, and we still do see the loss of grassland, sadly, through farming intensification. We're not talking big areas, but there is a nibbling away still of grass and habitat. So that is still a real threat. It kind of all links in when we talk about habitat decline, neglect and habitat management. Now, this is actually quite important because even with those sites of priority habitat grassland, that's the acid grasslands, our calcareous grassland, all the grassland types that have some measure of protection, if you like, not necessarily legally protected sites, but recognized for their priority habitat status. We are seeing probably the decline in management. And what we mean by that, what I mean by that is a decline in grazing management. As an example, it may be a cessation of hay cutting. And with that, we are then seeing a change from those grassland habitats shifting to scrubby habitats. Now, of course, there are benefits for grasslands having scrub on them for other wildlife. But when it becomes too much, the grass and fungi communities will be compromised because they'll lose basically open ground to develop in. It's as simple as that. And the picture that I've got there is a classic grassland site grazed by, in this case, interestingly, by dairy cattle. And they're just put out there as dry cows to graze a fairly steep slope. And that management is absolutely perfect for this waxcap grassland. And interestingly, so again related, is a change in farming practices. And the incentives. I work a lot on the development of agri-environment schemes, and any change in farming practice away from livestock farming could see a fundamental and serious decline in the grasslands where waxcap occurs. So it's very important that we try and maintain those kind of low intensity grazing and management systems. I could talk a lot more about that, but I won't do tonight because it's a big area. Now, interestingly as well, the government, and that's the past government, the current government, came up with tree planting targets. And again, very well-meaning schemes, and something that invariably we do need to increase our tree cover. But a lot of the tree planting is often proposed on sites that are fringe habitats and fringe grasslands that may actually be important for waxcap grasslands. And again, the same issues with tree planting are there will be no grazing, no other management. The grass will be allowed to grow long. And actually, as the trees develop and into more mature trees, after 20 to 30 years, if the actual sward height itself and that lack of management hasn't got rid of the waxcap communities, the tree canopy as it closes. And interestingly as well, different fungal communities moving in, there is actually some belief now that the fungal communities associated with trees may actually outcompete the grassland fungi assemblage as well. That's a bit of that's kind of not 100% developed, but it's definitely something that we believe is likely to be occurring. Again, it links in a little bit with new conservation ideas. Now, rewilding is, I think, a real key part of nature recovery in this country. And if it's delivered with grazing as part of that element of rewilding, rather than just abandonment, which will have its value, of course, then hopefully important grassland sites will be maintained under the rewilding remit. So that's an interesting one just to conjure, and I suspect we'll have probably some interesting views about that. There are very few protected sites for waxcap grasslands. I'll mention that a little bit later. And perhaps one of the biggest unknowns is climate change. I know from my point of view, and I've been surveying sites, that I remember looking at a south-facing slope that the previous year I'd recorded a really rich waxcap assemblage. Now, waxcaps are very erratic, as are other CHEGD fungi in terms of their fruiting appearance. But what I've noticed on some of the dry south-facing slopes, particularly where the summer and autumn rain doesn't come or the temperatures have been very hot, there has sometimes been very little in terms of mushrooms appearing. Whether that has any long-term impact is impossible to say. So I think there's a bit of a watching brief on terms of climate change and what impacts they'll have on fungi. I'm sure they will have some, and it does seem that the most resilient sites, and this is purely anecdotal, are probably going to be on those northerly and westerly facing slopes, which do not get that summer baking and retain more moisture. And interestingly as well, things like mossy, more humid grasslands are maintained. So yeah, again, one to definitely watch. And so just coming around again a little bit in terms of nature recovery and nature conservation strategies, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the diagram there, which comes from the Lawton principles of bigger, better, and more joined up, in terms of, we want to try and make our sites bigger, we want to try and join them up, and in terms of management, making sure that that management is still maintained, or if it's rewilding, decide what those objectives are. But I put there a tree planting thing, and the thing with tree planting is it's good, but it's also about the tree in the right place as well. And there has been a few cases where trees have been planted on a couple of very important waxcap sites, partly because we haven't understood where they were. And that's another important thing to say, is that we still, despite the work that I will talk about in a minute, in terms of finding and understanding where these sites are, there are still a lot of sites to be discovered. Dare I say, if you're a keen amateur mycologist, want to get out there and do some citizen science, this is a real opportunity actually to do that work and find out if you can find some new sites, and then work with the local wildlife trusts, the record centres, to then make people aware of those as well, particularly important. So when we talk about species richness, I mentioned at the beginning about the importance of chalk downland as an example for the number of wildflower species it supports. And it's not a competition here, but what it is more about really understanding and re-evaluating what we mean by the biodiversity of these habitats, because we think that 30 or 40 species of wildflower plants is particularly rich. The work that I've been doing and others have been doing is now coming up with a grassland fungi assemblage whereby there are now at least 250 different species of grassland fungi in the CHEGD group. And on a typical very rich site, we may be looking at anything from 50 to 100 different grassland fungi occurring on that. So not only have we got the rich assemblage of plants, we've also got this especially potentially rich assemblage of fungi. And if you add that to the insect assemblage and all the other wildlife that might occur there, these grassland habitats are a lot richer than I think anyone really appreciated up until recently. Now, one of the reasons we know that they are that rich is not just from the traditional fruiting body surveys, where you go out and record these mushrooms that are occurring, but we also know now as well, looking at the eDNA work that's been done, that we can add even more species to that overall number. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the DNA. So what does DNA mean for grassland fungi? Well, first of all, when we talk about environmental DNA, we're talking about going out, collecting soil. And we're only talking about collecting the first sort of 6 inches, the first 12, 15 centimeters of the soil in a grid on a site where we believe there might be important grassland fungi. There is a methodology laid out in a research document by Natural England, which you can find online. I haven't put a link up here, but if you look for DNA and fungi, you will be able to find the methodologies of how to carry out that collection of soil samples. And then that soil is then sent off to a lab where it goes through the process of separating out the soil, going through sequencing, and then ultimately determining what species of fungi are then found within that particular area using the samples, the material of fungi that's left in the actual soil, if you like. That's a very poor way of describing it, and if there's any like I say, if you want more detail, it's worth looking at the research report. And what is actually the DNA revealing? The first thing to say really is that it's adding to the overall species complement of grassland fungi, maybe 20 to 30%. I mean, it could be more, but if we say for sake of argument that it's adding another 20 to 30% of species to a list where we've already had, for example, fruiting body surveys. I was involved with a project on Exmoor with a consultant who did the fruiting body survey, and this was a very, very rich site, and the fruiting body survey actually revealed that there was just over 70 odd species of fungi in the CHEGD group. When we had the eDNA analysis done, that total went up from around 72 species to just over 100. So straight away, that site became one of the richest sites in the UK. But obviously that was because we'd done a lot more detailed analysis, but it showed the potential of eDNA in terms of revealing the full, or at least a fuller complement of the species that could be found. And interestingly, the picture of the club there, the white club, DNA is revealing that the number of clubs, corals and spindles that are found on a site is far greater using DNA analysis than fruiting body surveys will generally pick up. In addition to that, it's telling us actually that we've got species that have never been found in the UK or even in Europe, species that are new to science, species that have been found in New Zealand but have never been found as fruiting bodies within the UK or Europe before. So that's a really fascinating discovery. From a slightly disappointing point of view, from an amateur mycology or even a professional mycological point of view, is that also telling us that we might not be getting our identification as accurate as we thought. And so the two red species I put up here, the splendid waxcap in the middle and the crimson waxcap, are two quite closely related species that look quite similar. And actually what the DNA analysis has found from the 30 plus samples that I've looked at and from the contracts that we've let, is that splendid waxcap is probably over-recorded and is particularly rare. Crimson waxcap is found in nearly all the samples that I've actually seen. So it's throwing up a few kind of questions about how we're actually identifying our fungi. And I think finally as well, there are some species that actually fruit very rarely. One of those is called black magic or Dermaloma magicum. When the DNA has been done, it's often the case, and I think it's probably in at least 50% of the samples that I've seen, that the Dermaloma magicum appears in that number of samples. But in terms of when it appears in terms of producing a mushroom, it's far, far rarer. And it looks like, again, that it's a shy in terms of its appearance, and it may be that unless you do traditional surveys every year for 10 years, that you may not actually get it at all. You have to do a lot of surveys to reveal some of these species, whereas DNA will pick them up, hope in most instances, very frequently. Interestingly, finally, there is 1 or 2 species that don't seem to turn up at all in DNA. And it's very easy to identify a species called the yellowfoot waxcap. But in terms of that appearing in DNA samples, it's exceptionally rare. And it's not that rare a species, it has to be said, in grassland fungi assemblages. So that's a little run through of DNA and its importance. I just wanted to finish in terms of the overall nature conservation importance of what we have in England using the IUCN red listing. And when we talk about international importance and species like pandas, for example, everybody's familiar with those as very rare, very threatened species. Well, it turns out that within England alone, we have now got 26 species of waxcaps and a few other of the CHEGD group that are on the IUCN red list just for England, or just occurring in England, I should say, not just for England. So in terms of their global importance, you can see straight away that grassland fungi are very well represented in terms of their status in this country, and they've been red listed globally. And that really, I think, should give you a kind of notion of just how important these sites are. What's happening to inform the nature conservation of Waxcap Grasslands? I just wanted to put this slide in to show some of the partners, and this is by no and collaborators within the work that I've been doing. This is not a complete list, but I need to give a shout out to bodies like Plant Life, and if you're interested in citizen science, well worth going onto their Waxcap Watch site for different resources. Obviously, Natural England, who I work for, has been putting resource into doing the work that I've been doing, and the British Mycological Society and their fungal records database is still the largest repository for data for the records that we use. But coming up on the outside lane is things like iRecord and iNaturalist and other platforms. And I've been working a lot with the biological record centres, and a shout out for Sussex, who were contracted to do some work for us in detail, which is great. And local fungi groups, Leicestershire Fungi Group, again, another shout out for them, who've been particularly great in terms of providing me with records, but so have others as well. So that's been a really great collaborative project. And again, Aberystwyth University, because of their DNA work and just the conversations I've had with people like Gareth Griffith, has been absolutely fantastic in informing our nature conservation kind of understanding. So yeah, big shout out for them, and all very important bodies in terms of the nature conservation of fungi in this country. So what has been happening? So in 2015, I started delving through my work into what was open source data to try and compile an England grassland fungi database. And I very quickly realized that the number of records and the amount of information I could find was never going to be adequate. So in 2021, 23 and 2024, 25, I was able to survey on a contract to analyze all the records from as many sources as possible to build up a new database. And the reason I go back to 2003 is because there were just 20,000 records that informed the first conservation assessment for England. And you can see that by the time we got to 2025, the number of records is significantly more, 5.5 times more than we had 20 plus years ago. So it's and that makes the whole use of that data more robust in terms of modeling, in terms of species distributions, etc. So it's a really, really important piece of work in terms of informing where these species occur in the country. And I'm going to run out of time soon probably, but I'll just keep going for a little while. There's been a review of previous work, obviously things like the important fungus areas, which is publicly available on the Magic Map, the 2004 English Nature at the time, first assessment done by Shelley Evans. And in 2012, there was a small contract done by Justin Smith identifying key fungal sites in England with the potential for notifying them as SSSIs. And that was kind of the framework which I built on from that piece of work. It's an unpublished report, unfortunately, but that was the kind of basis for going forward with this. And then in 2015 there was an internal assessment done looking at the SSSI series to see where Waxcap Grasslands stood, and what we found was that it was probably the least covered of a kind of habitat type, if you like, or species assemblage in terms of the whole SSSI series. So with this data in mind, what's been happening or what's in the pipeline? I mean, to be fair, a lot of this is happening now, and we can talk about this. So with the data that's come in, and you can see what's happened over the last four to 5 years, is that compiling all the data together, we can now say that we've got over 280, and I know that figure is going to go up slightly, sites across the country that would meet the SSSI thresholds. That means that there are that number of sites that could, in theory, qualify as sites of special scientific interest. And you can see there's a widespread. Probably a few biases there. You might notice Dorset is well covered as I put some dots on the map, but actually there is some interesting further analysis behind that, which is going to be done soon. One of the interesting things is in terms of grass and fungi sites are widespread. They occur everywhere across the country, which again is great if you're an amateur naturalist and want to get into this group, because it doesn't matter whether you're in Cornwall or Essex, Cumbria or Kent. There are grass and fungi sites for you to find. And particularly in the lowlands, as I said, churches, graveyards, cemeteries, all rich hunting grounds. But particularly what I would love people to do is to go out and find their chalk, their acid, grassland sites. And if you've got access onto those, is to start looking at those now as well. Because I know that I can still go out and find new sites pretty much every year. And not just one or two, but sometimes half a dozen, if I've got the time, more sites where I will find grass and fungi. That doesn't mean to say they're all nationally important, but there is a real opportunity for people to find new sites. Some of the work with the data that's happened is that there's been the development of heat maps or hotspots, and we now can come up with a series of areas that show that some areas are more important than others. And some modelling work that was done, one of my colleagues in Natural England, Matt Wainhouse, shout out for Matt, was working with the CEH, Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, using different environmental variables like rainfall, slope, temperature, to see if we can model using the data that we've derived to see where that some of the more important areas of the country are. It's fair to say that you can see on that map, which is a real hotspot map, that there is a bias towards the west and some upland areas as well. I mentioned Hadrian's Wall as being a particularly important area, as is the Peak District in Derbyshire. But there are other hotspot areas. The Weald in Sussex is important. And there are, again, even in Norfolk in the Brecks, where interestingly you won't see so many waxcaps, but you will see other CHEGD, important CHEGD sites. So there again, there's more scope and more work to be done with that, but that's just an example of how some of the data has been used. And there's further nature conservation objectives being developed. And there, one of the key outcomes here is we want to ensure that the database is maintained. It's an organic database that's updated. Hopefully very, very soon, and I keep saying this in various other presentations that I've given, we're desperate to get out a public-facing map that people can interrogate and look at to see where their waxcap grassland sites are. I've been developing a scoring system so that, again, it goes back to local and county sites that hopefully will develop county inventories. Also, with this amount of data, it does mean that there'll be some refining of the SSI CHEGD scoring system. And ultimately, I mean, it's incredible to, I think when I was told there was 250 people on this call, which is incredible, quite frankly. That level of interest is very gratifying. And I can't stress enough, we want to get people out there. And again, fabulous that there's so many people on the call. Site protection, something that, working for Natural England, that I'm often involved with. There has been some progress. We now do have 5 sites. Back in 2004, but there was only 1. So it's slow, but there has been 5 sites that have now been protected where grassland fungi are a key interest feature. That is important because it means that in terms of management, that we can outline management objectives for those SSI sites to maintain those grassland fungi communities. And critically, as the data's come in, being able to identify that there are some very high priority sites across the country that deserve to be recognised for as SSIs. And finally, as well, obviously with the actual existing protected sites network, what we've discovered is that there are a lot of SSIs with very important waxcap grasslands. And so as part of an internal process where we're looking to monitor and add stuff to our monitoring framework, if you like, we're hoping that we can add waxcap grasslands as something to be considered in management, again, management objectives for those sites. So that's an important piece of ongoing work. The final outcome, from my point of view, and to get this piece of work out there into the public domain. And there's been lots of delays for all sorts of reasons, which I won't go into. But this is the title, and this is the project that all this data and all this assessment is going to lead to, with a new conservation assessment coming out very soon. And fingers crossed, that will be in the public domain as a research report, which will put a lot of flesh on the bones from everything I've talked about tonight. There's lots of ongoing work, and I think it's important to just say this, that there are key staff within my own organisation and other bodies and partners. The National Trust, again, deserve a shout out because they are singly probably one of the most important landowners for supporting grassland fungi sites, but potentially globally, in fact. With the tree planting, we have a tree action plan staff, tree action plan delivery staff, and they work very closely with myself and others, and particularly with the Forestry Commission and other woodland planting organisations like the Woodland Trust, in helping to determine where some of these sites can be planted with trees without harming waxcap grassland sites. So that's a particularly important internal piece of work. I've worked on the agri-environment and management guidelines, and waxcap grasslands now are recognised within the agri-environment as being a special feature where they can attract a payment, an incentive payment under the agri-environment schemes. And I've been working with the Forestry Commission ecologists, who increasingly have been looking at the importance of waxcap grasslands, again, like I say, in terms of tree planting, and that's been a positive collaboration as well. Local environment record centres, they've been particularly important. We want to continue working with them, and of course, learned bodies, particularly people like the British Mycological Society and universities. Aberystwyth, again, deserves a mention because of the work on eDNA which has been critical. I know we're probably almost run out of time, but I'm almost there. I feel like I've covered a lot of ground, but I think it's worth just reiterating. The UK is of international importance for Waxcap grasslands. How do we know that? Well, as part of the work that I've been doing in terms of that conservation assessment, we've been looking obviously to see what our mycological colleagues have been doing across Europe. And so the Danish, for example, fantastic mycologists, identified 140 top sites within their country. And we know that other countries like Norway, Slovenia, and others have got important waxcap grasslands. But when we started looking at the data and started putting together the number of sites that we have in the UK, and obviously I include England in that, the number of sites was a magnitude far, far higher. And there I will show a slightly out of date bar chart to kind of illustrate that point. You'd have to put the countries alongside each other. I won't do that here, but that will be in the report when it finally comes out. We also have species that deserve special recognition, and the pink waxcap is one example. Now, once upon a time, it was actually a biodiversity action plan species. And the reason for that is because the UK is thought to actually support 50% of the European sites. It's still IUCN red listed as vulnerable. Interestingly, it is actually quite common. It's one of the commoner waxcaps that occurs in our grasslands. When you look at all the data, it's well up there. But that shouldn't detract from its importance in terms of its UK status. The same again is true of the big blue pink gill. Now that's a group of different entelomas, but for sake of this presentation, we're just going to call them big blue pink gills. And again, look at the figures. We think that it's 55% plus of the European sites are found in the UK. And then finally, the Jubilee waxcap, only identified as a species or in 2013. And it looks again like the UK is the centre of its population. Now, it does occur elsewhere in Europe, and it may be that it's found more widely now that it's been pinpointed as a species, identified as a species. But again, it's on the IUCN red list as a vulnerable species. And the reason why they're vulnerable is largely to do with the decline in grasslands, as simple as that, and the decline in terms of the destruction of grasslands still occurring across Europe, but also that decline in management as well, moving away from pastoral grazing systems and hay meadow management. And they are the key mechanisms as to why these grasslands are disappearing. So that just gives you a flavour of some of the species that are of international importance and why Britain is so important. Now I think we're almost there. This is a little bit out of date. And in fact, the number of sites that would meet hygrocybe, the waxcap thresholds at county level, regional, etc., different levels that you can see along the bottom there. We've got 845 sites. Now, just because a site that comes in terms of my knowledge, only has 10 or 11 species, that isn't the end of the story. I would say go back and go and survey it again and again, because it's highly likely that you're going to find more species. And that's the same of those, obviously, that fall below the thresholds of national importance. That you obviously have to have a cut-off somewhere. But just using these thresholds that we've got, as you can see, and say an update of this will actually show that there are over 1,000 sites now in England alone that meet the lower threshold of over 1,000 sites with 10 or 11 species of grass and fungi. The number of international sites is double what it is on that chart now. And that's really important. We're now looking, you saw with the SSSI thresholds earlier, that 287 sites now meet the SSSI thresholds. So I'd say this is just an illustration of what we had a few years ago. And I apologise, I haven't had time to run all the data through there. But yeah, there's a lot of important sites. And like I say, if you compare that in terms of regional and national sites with other countries such as Denmark, we have probably 4 to 5 times more sites, known sites, than some of those other countries. I just want to finish with this quote from Donald Rumsfeld. It's a very famous, actually, quote, as I'm sure many of you will know. As we know, there are known knowns, and there are things we know and we know. Well, you can read it yourself. The beautiful mushroom there, which has been given the tentative name of toffee waxcap, is still very rare. And in 2022, there were hardly any records for this particular waxcap. So then all of a sudden, it appeared in multiple sites across the country. What we don't know about, not just waxcaps, but all of fungi and grassland fungi, is much about their ecology. And we're learning all the time. A friend of mine who's a brilliant mycologist, and I don't know if she's on the call, Emma Williams from South Wales, actually showed me last year the possible association between meadow waxcap and one of the skinny clubs. And the more and more we look, and the more people are looking, the more we're discovering. So there's a whole world out there of wonderful waxcaps we've discovered. Hopefully you've enjoyed my presentation. And yeah, I will leave it there. Thank you.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Sean. That was fascinating, and such an introduction into a world that I definitely didn't know that much about, but am now completely captivated. We have about 20 minutes for a Q&A, so that we wrap up about 9 p.m. And we've had some really fantastic, varied questions. So I'm keen to just leap straight into them, if that's okay. So as much as you said that talking about grazing and grazing systems with waxcaps was a story for another time, it seems to have really intrigued many of our audience. So we'll cover a few of those, and then we'll head into a different topic. We're fortunate to have such variety. So I think maybe we'll start with this one from David Carey, who simply asked, why is the UK so good for waxcaps compared to other countries which also have extensive grazing practices? Really good question. Thanks, David.
It's a very, very good question, actually. There's probably a little bit of knowledge base here. So Britain has a fantastic number of amateur naturalists going out there recording. So we're probably, I think it goes without saying, probably the best recorded country in the world, actually. So that definitely helps. But there is also the climatic variables as well. We're an oceanic country. And actually, combined with the grasslands that we have and that oceanic element, high rainfall, okay, that's quite variable these days, it seems, but that high rainfall, there's still extensive upland grasslands, still very extensive sheep walks, as an example. Now, of course, there might be all sorts of views about sheep grazing and uplands, the rest of it. That's another big debate, but it's definitely that climatic variable. And I think I didn't actually say in the presentation that actually waxcaps occur in forests in America, for example, and they're not necessarily a grassland species. I went to New Zealand last year as well, and I was finding pink gills in the forests of New Zealand. So this fungal group, there is 1 or 2 woodland sites that they're very rich in this country. There's a site in Kent that supports a very rich waxcap assemblage, but it's very rare to find those. So it's a really good question. I can't answer it as thoroughly as perhaps we like. So there's an element of climate, there's an element of recording, but even across Europe, I think, just coming back to the grazing question, there is a decline in those traditional pastoral systems. So that's a concern. That probably doesn't answer the full science behind it, but hopefully that, and maybe we can come on to it again, I don't know.
Yeah, no, you've answered that brilliantly, and fascinating to imagine forests with waxcaps in them. That's really cool. Richard asked a question that is related to grazing, and he wants to know if there is a hiatus in management, so an exclusion of grazing, for example, how long will waxcaps remain viable in soil without fruiting? A few years or decades? Or
It's a brilliant question, actually, and I have got some anecdotal examples. I do know of a chalk and neutral grassland fairly close to where I live in Dorset, and interestingly, the farmer was grazing it and just couldn't get his grazing management right, and he gave up the grazing management completely. And he was in a scheme many years ago, and that grassland. When the Wildlife Trust went to survey it to make it into a county wildlife site, it was so rank that they decided not to notify it as a county wildlife site. Anyway, there was probably a gap of about 8 years, and the farmer decided, I'm going to graze it again. And he grazed it really hard. And I went there and had a look purely by accident and got to know the farmer. And the upshot was that after about 10 years, no, not 10 years, sorry, 8 year gap without grazing, and then 2 years afterwards, I actually recorded a regionally important Waxcap Grassland site. So it's clear with that one example, and I'm sure other people would have others, that they will persist. There's no question. The community, the assemblage will persist in long grassland. And I should say that even in longer grassland, if you really search hard, you will find waxcaps and other fungi. But there will come a point, and we don't know exactly what it is, when they will struggle. And a bit like plants, interestingly, some of the smaller waxcaps and some of the smaller fungi will really struggle in that environment. And we don't know how that affects sporulation, for example, and fruiting, because there's also potentially a link. And again, a lot of this is untested, with warming of the soil, wetting of the soil. And what you often get with ranker grasslands is, if you feel the temperature in autumn, it's quite cold. So there needs to be elements of warming, wetting, and all those things. I say our understanding of the ecology of these things is very imperfect at the moment, but it is a brilliant question, and the real answer is that we don't honestly know, but we can at least say that reinstatement of grazing after some neglect on former waxcap sites or sites that we know are important does seem to help restore that community, that assemblage.
That's really interesting. And that actually leads on really nicely to Robin's question when you mentioned about wetting and things like that. But can a grassland be too wet for waxcaps, and does the soil need to be well drained? Is there a kind of Goldilocks scenario?
It's another great question, actually. And again, there is some evidence to suggest that, well, again, I should have probably said somewhere in the presentation that it does appear that the best waxcap grassland sites appear to be free draining. So that doesn't mean to say they're drained necessarily, but it does mean that they're not waterlogged soils. That's not to say that waxcaps don't occur in bogs and waterlogged sites with rushes, etc., but they tend to be less common, that's for sure. So that they tend to be free draining sites. And I know of one important site in the northwest where it was artificially drained, and the waxcap assemblage is absolutely phenomenal. The drains are now degrading, and there does appear to be a decline in the waxcap assemblage and other fungi. So it comes back to that balance between, if you like, abandonment, rewilding, traditional management, etc. So as conservationists, we're having to make these kind of decisions for, as I said, an internationally important taxon group here. So it's a brilliant question, but yeah, generally they prefer free draining sites. You'll hear, Sophie, a lot of general comments from me, because like I say, the true status of all these things is still...
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. And it's exciting to be at a point where we're sort of still finding out so much about such a rare species in our country. There were lots of lots of questions, but one that I'm also keen to know about as well, just because here in Devon is just surrounded by development and landscape change. And Louise has asked, what protections are there to protect waxcap grasslands from development? If you know.
Again, another very, very
unfolding picture. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a really good question, actually. What I'm aiming and hoping for, myself and my colleague Matt Wainhouse, is that we're hoping to make waxcap grasslands into a priority habitat, which will at least give them equivalent status. And I have to be a little bit careful because of my role in Natural England. But obviously, part of the work that I do is to try and promote and protect waxcap grasslands as it is grasslands in general. So we are hoping that we will get them equivalent status as, say, a chalk grassland, a lowland meadow, and a lowland acid grassland as typical examples. So at the moment, they don't have formal protection. However, if you can demonstrate the importance of a grassland for its waxcaps, then local authorities, in terms of planning, should be taking into account the value of, just because it doesn't have a priority habitat status, it does have a wildlife status. I've already said we've got IUCN red list species. There are what we call section 41 species that do have legal protections. Now they're rare, and the chances are that those development sites are not going to have some of those species. And it is an evolving picture, Sophie. You're right, and it's not a particularly satisfactory picture. People don't want to see their area of grassland lost, and I don't want to see grasslands lost as well. So, as I say, the most important thing you can do is to get out there and try and identify them in the first place. Let your wildlife trusts know. Let your local environment record centres know, because at the very least, they can hopefully let, if your local authority has got an ecologist still, they can let that local authority ecologist know. And then they do have to at least look at them in terms of wildlife importance. I can't give any guarantees, and I wish we could protect more. I really do, but it's a tricky area.
Definitely. And so in terms of there seems to be lots of calls to action, which is really nice from your talk, because often that's quite difficult with conservation. That's kind of especially a sort of changing picture. But you mentioned about public facing maps, and you talked a lot about how accessible waxcaps are in our everyday locality, from cemeteries and other places, and these kind of hidden ancient grasslands that are sort of right under our nose as well. A couple of people have asked about these maps, and are they publicly available? And David has also asked, are there any proposed mapping, or is any proposed mapping going to link into the local nature recovery strategies that are now rolling out?
We have been consulted just on the local nature recovery strategies. We have been consulted internally about some aspects. Some local authorities, and as part of the strategies, we've had some consultations. But it's not a satisfactory picture because the maps aren't publicly available at the moment. I'm one of only a very small group that have access to those maps, and the reason we can't produce those maps at the moment, and we are looking to resolve that ASAP, and I really do mean that, is it's all to do with licensing and open government licensing in terms of production of data and records. That is nearly resolved, and that's the only reason really that's held up the production of the maps, quite frankly. So the aim is, as I said, that we're doing the conservation assessment, is to get that. Honestly, that's been a bit of an albatross round for me in terms of getting that report out. But the aim is to have that report come out, and with it, the mapping as well. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed and hoping that I can have enough time to get the map and that report out at the same time. So if you can just bear with us, that information will be available, and it will be accessible for people to, like I say, scrutinize. There'll be drop-down menus to be able to look at where their important waxcap sites are. We are a little bit constrained about the exact locations for some of these, but it will give you a rough area of where those are, and then hopefully then people can consult with their wildlife trusts and local record centres, etc., maybe even Natural England, to find out exactly where these sites are.
Fantastic, that's really useful. Something to look forward to then. Again, in a more kind of seasonal, practical mood, Louise has asked, what's the best time of year for surveying waxcap grasslands? When should we be out and about looking for them?
Well, I'll be shot if I don't say something that Emma Williams, I like to say, I don't know if Emma's on the call, but Emma will say all times of year are good for waxcaps. But the reality is, if you're restricted and can't get out, I mean, if for example, the conditions are okay, and a good example, a few years ago, we had a lot of rain. Last year, we had a lot of rain in August, if I remember rightly. If you're getting the right conditions, there's no reason why you couldn't go out as early as August. But if you are restricted for time, and I often am as well, there's a period from the first week of October to the middle of November as when that is probably the best time to go out and try and find waxcaps, okay? Largely because the weather has changed, it's got wetter, it's more reliable in terms of the mushrooms appearing, and they definitely appear more when the nights are cooler as well. The one downside is a hard frost will wipe out the mushrooms just like that. So you can end the season very, very quickly. So I would urge, if you're now getting the rain in September, which I know we are down here, and I'm sure you are in Devon and other parts of the country, go out now, because there is a real chance that you'll start finding things. If you don't find things straight away, the chances are you're not looking hard enough either. And you've really, for earth tongues and the clubs, corals and spindles, it's definitely nose to the ground type searching as well. If you ever come on or go, not just my courses, but other courses, there are techniques for separating the turf to look for them. So you really have to kind of manipulate the turf, dare I say, to try and find these things. But the key months are October into mid-November. But go now because it started raining.
Yeah, brilliant. We've certainly had tons of rain today, so we're going to add that for my autumn to-do list. It's quite exciting, actually. Right, we probably have time for one more question, and so I thought it would be nice to answer Tim's question. And Tim has asked, Tim has asked, what would you say, Sean, to a 17-year-old applying to university who wants to be an ecologist?
Oh, golly, that's a big question.
A budding mycologist, maybe.
Well, hopefully so. Yeah. What would I say? Well, I would say, because I was in that position myself once upon a time, I started off in forestry, just to let you know. So I was cutting down trees and planting trees. That's how I started. But I would say volunteer. Definitely go out and volunteer. Get that bit of experience. Go out and I started with birds, like a lot of people do, and it's a great way in. But if you're not into birds, do fungi, definitely. And there is some real rewards with doing more obscure groups, I would say, because there is a chance you can actually find something that nobody else has done. I've found 8 new species of fungi for Dorset. So I would go out and join a recording group, do some volunteering. It looks great on your CV. And it's a tough world out there because there's a lot of people that want to work in nature. And, I came through a slightly circuitous route, like I say, in forestry, and ended up being an ecologist working in the New Forest with Forestry Commission. But yeah, I would say that. Get into a group. I did flies at one point, hoverflies, all those things are really valuable. And just, and actually, I'm going to say one final thing. Believe what you're doing is good, because my God, we need ecologists more than ever. And that's probably the most important message. We need more younger people to stand up for the natural environment. We really do.
What a lovely note to end on. Sean, thank you so much for your talk. That was fantastic and lots of food for thought there. So before we finish up, a couple of quick things. So tonight's talk from Sean has been recorded and will be available on the More Meadows YouTube channel later this week. So do check it out again if you want to go through it a bit more slowly and look at Sean's slides at your own pace, or share it, better still, with someone who you think will enjoy it. And if you haven't checked out the channel on More Meadows YouTube yet, it's full of brilliant videos, from identifying native meadow grasses to creating your own wildflower meadow, managing hedgerows for wildlife, and even conservation grazing. And the link will be in the chat box here, so do go and check that out. Our next online talk is on the 9th of October at 7:30, and unfortunately you'll be hearing from me again, as I'll be chatting about my new book, To Have or to Hold, which celebrates the incredible interconnectedness between species and symbiotic relationships that make up the natural environment. And as always, it's free to join, so you can register to receive the link for the talk on the events page of the More Meadows website, which is just moremeadows.org.uk. And finally, if you have a meadow anywhere in Devon or the southwest, no matter what the size, please consider adding it and doing your bit for citizen science and adding it to the More Meadows map. This is a really brilliant way to show the collective impact of everyone helping to reverse wildlife declines across the country. And amazingly, as of this week, More Meadows is at 3,337 acres. And can we get that to 4,000 together? That would be something really special. Anyway, a huge thank you to tonight's speaker, Sean Cooch, and to all of you for joining us. We're so blown away by how many people have been on this call. So thank you so much for spending your time here this evening. And thank you to Steve, who's behind the scenes and making sure that this talk ran smoothly despite some initial tech issues earlier. Anyway, enjoy the evening, and thank you again for being here, and we'll see you soon.